The Business Buzz.
Good evening and welcome to The Business Buzz, the program by Newsfirst, which is focused on news and activities centered around the economy of Sri Lanka. I'm Theruni Karuna-Ratna. Let's start off with the headlines.
The Executive Board of the IMF will examine the review of Sri Lanka's progress at a meeting in Washington today. The deadline for expressions of interest in the purchase of Sri Lanka Telecom and Sri Lankan Airlines has been extended. Selling off white elephants. India-Russia joint venture to take over Mattala Rajapaksa International Airport. What will it take to turn Sri Lanka into an international shipping hub? Food for thought. It's the government's duty to ensure that there are no further shocks to the economy.
We start out with some market news. Sri Lankans will soon be paying more for everything, much more. And that's because the Parliament on Monday voted by 100 votes to 55 to increase the current VAT, which is at 15%, to a whopping 18%, starting from the 1st of January 2024. Now, what is worse is that 97 more items that were at 0% VAT have now been moved off the exempt list and will be taxed at 18%. That will surely drive inflation up by a significant margin. This move is expected to increase the government revenue by 378 billion rupees next year. But can Sri Lankans really afford to pay such an enormous amount to bankroll a set of corrupt politicians, bureaucratic fat cats in government agencies, loss-making state-owned enterprises and repaying high-interest loans for white elephants? Now keep in mind that 5.7 million Sri Lankans already cannot afford 3 meals a day. Newsfirst will continue to bring you the latest updates on this VAT situation from all of our programs. And for more on this VAT controversy, do make sure to tune in to Face the Nation, Sri Lanka's premier English talk show, tomorrow at 9:30 on TV1. Meanwhile, Fitch Ratings said today that the world economic growth is expected to fall sharply in 2024. But the good news is that a possible recession in the United States has been avoided. Fitch Ratings says in its latest Global Economic Outlook report that the world economic growth is expected to fall sharply to just 2.1% in 2024. Fitch Ratings noted that world growth was held up well in 2023, driven by normalization of consumption in China and a pickup in US growth, which have outweighed a sharp slowdown in Europe in the wake of last year's regional energy shock. But with the full impact of recent monetary tightening still to be felt, plus China's ongoing property slump and the Eurozone economy stagnating, the outlook has been revised for 2024, although it's revised up slightly from Fitch Ratings' previous forecast. The good news is that Fitch has revised upwards its 2023 world growth forecast to 2.9% from 2.5% in the September report, with the United States raised by 0.4 percentage points to 2.4% and China by 0.5 percentage points to 5.3%. Growth in emerging markets excluding China was also raised by 0.2 percentage points to 3.6%. Eurozone growth forecast is at 0.5%, little changed from the previous forecast. Fitch has revised up its forecast for global growth in 2024 by 0.2 percentage points, with a 0.9 percentage points increase in the US to 1.2%, outweighing the 0.4 percentage points cut to Eurozone growth to 0.7%. Central banks are nervous about making a premature declaration of victory in the fight against inflation and will keep rates restrictive for some time. Now, this is according to Fitch Ratings in its latest Global Economic Outlook report. Fitch Ratings says that the tight labor market conditions are making the US Federal Reserve nervous about wage inflation remaining high. Against the backdrop of stronger than expected growth, Fitch expects one more hike in the federal funds rate in January 2024. The Fed is then expected to keep the rates on hold until July and then to cut by 100 basis points by year end to an upper range of 4.75%. The ECB is expected to start easing in April, reducing rates by 75 basis points by higher end, taking the main refinancing rate to 3.75%. By contrast, the Bank of Japan is expected to raise its policy rate next year. This would be the first tightening since 2007. Core inflation has fallen slightly faster than anticipated, particularly in the Eurozone. Core goods prices have stabilized globally as supply chain pressures have eased. Services inflation and nominal wage growth have also fallen significantly in the Eurozone, but less so in the United States and the United Kingdom, where they remain high. Today is a decisive day for Sri Lanka as the Executive Board of the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, in Washington is scheduled to consider the first review of the IMF program to Sri Lanka.
The first review of Sri Lanka's International Monetary Fund program is scheduled to go before the IMF Executive Board for consideration on the 12th of December. Sri Lankan officials are expecting the review to be completed this month after the country's official creditors gave their assurances on debt restructuring. The Executive Board will examine the performance of the government of Sri Lanka with regard to various economic and financial criteria. The government of Sri Lanka has performed well on a number of targets, such as reducing inflation to manageable levels. The review, which was originally expected last September, would pave the way for the second tranche of $331 million to be disbursed by the IMF to the government.
There was some cheering news out of Manila a few days ago when the Asian Development Bank announced that it has approved a $200 million concessionary loan for the government of Sri Lanka. The Asian Development Bank, or ADB, announced last Friday that it has approved a $200 million concessional loan to the government of Sri Lanka to help stabilize the country's finance sector, which came under stress with the sovereign debt and economic crises that started in April 2022 when the government of Sri Lanka suspended its external debt payments. The ADB, in a statement, said that its financial sector stability and reforms program is comprised of two sub-programs, each of $200 million. Sub-Program 1, which is what has been approved, targets short-term stabilization and crisis management measures that were implemented in 2023. Sub-Program 2 is planned to be implemented in 2024 and focuses on structural reforms and long-term actions to restore growth in the banking sector. The entire program will help strengthen the stability and governance of the country's banking sector, improve the banking sector's asset quality, and deepen sustainable and inclusive finance, particularly for women-led micro, small and medium-sized enterprises. The ADB noted that according to the International Monetary Fund's latest review, Sri Lanka's economy is showing tentative signs of stabilization, although a full economic recovery is not yet assured. ADB Country Director for Sri Lanka, Takafumi Kadono, said the program's overarching development objective is fully aligned with the country's strategy of maintaining finance sector stability while ensuring that banks are well positioned for eventual recovery. The expected development outcome is a stable financial system, providing access to affordable finance for businesses in various sectors of the economy. The program is a follow-on assistance from ADB's crisis response under the special policy-based loan that was approved for Sri Lanka in May 2023. It is aligned with the fourth pillar of the IMF's extended fund facility provided to Sri Lanka to help the country regain financial stability. It is also in line with the government's reform agenda, including strengthening the operational independence of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka and its designation as the country's macroprudential authority. The IMF stated that in designing the Sub-Program 1 loan, the ADB has maintained close coordination and collaboration with the IMF to design targeted regulatory reforms for the banking sector, including asset quality review, and with the World Bank on strengthening the deposit insurance scheme. The loan is accompanied by a $1 million grant from the ADB's Technical Assistance Special Fund to provide advisory, knowledge and institutional capacity building for Sri Lanka's Ministry of Finance and the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. The December 18th deadline for expressions of interest to purchase the majority shares of Sri Lanka Telecom and Sri Lankan Airlines has been extended by 3 more weeks. Accordingly, the new deadlines are the 9th of January 2024 for Sri Lankan Airlines and the 12th of January 2024 for Sri Lanka Telecom.
The The State Enterprises Restructuring Unit of the Ministry of Finance said recently that it has extended the deadline for expressions of interest in the purchase of majority shareholdings of Sri Lanka Telecom and Sri Lankan Airlines due to requests by prospective investors who asked for more time to submit their documentation. The date for expressions of interest for Sri Lanka Telecom was extended to the 12th of January 2024 from the 18th of December. The date for Sri Lankan Airlines was extended to the 9th of January 2024 from the 5th of December. There is much focus on the sale of these two giant state entities, with employee unions and opposition parties keeping a watchful eye on proceedings. The International Finance Corporation, or IFC, is the transaction advisor for the proposed sale of shares of Sri Lanka Telecom and Sri Lankan Airlines, and also of Lanka Hospitals plc. Other government entities that the government of Sri Lanka has said are to be divested include Sri Lanka Insurance Corporation Limited, Canville Holdings Private Limited, which is the holding company of the Grand Hyatt Hotel building, Hotel Developers Lanka Limited, which is the owning company of the Hilton Colombo, and Litrogas Lanka Limited. Interestingly, several of these state-owned enterprises were privatized on previous occasions, but were later repurchased by the government of Sri Lanka for various different reasons. They include Sri Lankan Airlines, Litrogas, Lanka Hospitals, and the Sri Lanka Insurance Corporation. The State Enterprises Restructuring Unit of the Ministry of Finance was established by Cabinet decision in March of this year and is tasked with divesting various government entities, which is a key aspect of the government of Sri Lanka's attempts to restructure the state sector and obtain significant revenue for the state.
Now, Sri Lanka may have finally found a solution to the Mattala Rajapaksa International Airport, the massive white elephant in the elephant-infested jungle. The latest news is that the government of Sri Lanka has decided to hand over the operations of this airport to a private Russian-Indian joint venture.
Sri Lanka has decided to hand over the operations of the Mattala International Airport to a private Russian-Indian joint venture, according to Ports and Aviation Services Secretary KDS Ruan Chandra. Discussions on the matter last week were successful and an agreement will be inked in the near future. As per the agreement, all operations at the Mattala International Airport will be carried out by the Russian-Indian private joint venture. A portion of the revenue generated by the private joint venture in operating the Mattala International Airport will go to the state. This company will also pay the salaries and wages of the airport staff. The Sri Lankan government, which by the way is still bankrupt, currently spends over 2 billion rupees to operate and maintain the Mattala Rajapaksa International Airport, and with this latest move, such a massive cost would be avoided.
President Ranil Wickremesinghe has asked plantation companies to come to a collective agreement by the 31st of December this year on increasing wages to 1,700 rupees per day or reach a consensus on an alternative amount. That's a whopping 70% increase from the current 1,000 rupees. This came around the same time that the president announced that 2024 will be an election year with presidential, parliamentary and provincial council elections. President Ranil Wickremesinghe held a meeting with corporate heads of the plantation sector last week and urged them to engage in collaborative effort to establish a collective agreement on increasing the wages for plantation workers to 1,700 rupees as requested or reach consensus on the increased wage amount by the 31st of December. The minimum wage was last increased in October 2021 when it was made to 1,000 rupees per day. However, as with the rest of the population, plantation workers find it difficult to make ends meet due to the high cost of living after woefully erroneous economic policies drove the government into bankruptcy and sent the cost of living rocketing skywards. On the other hand, the plantation sector, which has been a bedrock of the country's economy for 2 centuries, is likely to struggle to accommodate such a huge increase.
The Business Buzz.
Tonight on The Deep Dive, we speak with well-known entrepreneur Rohan Masakorala, founder of Shippers Academy International, on what it will really take to turn Sri Lanka into a proper international shipping hub.
Good evening. On today's Deep Dive, we have Mr. Rohan Masakorala, the founder of Shippers Academy International. Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
So what do you think about the status of the investment climate, specifically in the shipping industry of Sri Lanka?
So Sri Lanka is absolutely a good spot for shipping related investments. Unfortunately, the country doesn't have the conducive environment for many decades, and as a result the country has lost out many investment opportunities, and it still remains the same without the necessary reforms, and the current economic crisis also does not adapt good to the country's investment climate, which has to be corrected soon. Otherwise, we may lag behind the regional competition, and our location story alone will not help us to become what we aspire to be as a regional giant in shipping and logistics.
So when it comes to the reforms, what do you think are the needed reforms in the industry?
Yeah, Sri Lanka, being an open and a free economy by theoretical means, is actually a bit of a protectionist country. We have not opened our doors for investors properly, in particularly the shipping sector, also in the ports and terminal sector. If you look at the ports and terminal sector, in the modern world, the ports are called landlord ports, where the government doesn't become the owner, operator and the regulator. But in Sri Lanka, under the Ports Authority Act, which is an old act, remains the same. So there is restrictive participation by international private capital and institutions. Whatever we do privatization in the port is government selective, not on bid basis or transparency. So we have gone behind in terms of the policy in the port sector itself. We are not a landlord port, whereas if you look at India, which came up much later in liberalizing the sector and opening up in 1991, has now Jawaharlal Nehru Port, the biggest port in India, is a fully landlord port. So Colombo has not opened its Colombo or any of our ports for that matter have not opened for international investors to properly come and invest in our terminals. It's a selective process which is not helpful for the country's openness. On the other hand, shipping companies and logistics companies too are not allowed to have their own offices in Sri Lanka. There's restrictive laws, protection given by government for local parties to run the operations on behalf of the principals. The principals are not allowed to come into this country. So there are these holes in the whole system that, which I said, doesn't help the investment climate of this country, and as a result we have stagnated as a transshipment hub for well over 40 years. Indeed, we started the reforms 40 years ago, but we have not walked the talk. As a result, country has lost a lot of opportunities, and we have also delayed projects one after the other. So business has moved from our country to other countries. Getting them back is a humongous task, and that is where we are right now.
How do you see the competition in the region?
Yeah, so monitoring over the last 30 years, competition has massively grown in the Indian subcontinent alone. So we are in the center of what we call the Indian Ocean. If you look at the maritime geography, if you look at to the east and the west of Sri Lanka, we have two major mega hubs, that is in the United Arab Emirates, Dubai, and of course Singapore. And in addition to that, over the last 30 years, we have seen a lot of developments in the Far East, that is Malaysia coming into play with two new ports, then in Oman, Salalah, where investors have gone and put mega ports. Now we see Red Sea ports coming in Saudi Arabia for transshipment. Abu Dhabi itself is joining the transshipment business, new transshipment ports. One has been already commissioned partially, which is starting operations next year, called Vizhinjam in Kerala state. And also the Delhi government just about 2 weeks back proposed a new transshipment port in Andaman Island in the middle of the Bay of Bengal. So Colombo is coming up to major transshipment competition, and transshipment is not the most lucrative business. It doesn't add a lot of value. So we need to go into backward integration into logistics. So as I said at the earlier stage, that to do all that we need legal and structural reforms in the economy. Otherwise competition will grab those investments and opportunities. So Sri Lanka has a long way to go to get itself to the next level, and that is going to be quite challenging under current circumstances.
Mr. Masakorala, could you also give us a brief about the current development of the industry in the region?
Yeah, so the regional development, if you start from Colombo itself, I mean our port, Colombo port, is the main port for containerized cargo, and that is our core business at the moment. Port of Colombo needs capacity. So we are at the moment having two development projects going on. But the fact remains that these two development projects are 10 years behind. So we've lost business, but hopefully by next year we will have two new terminals coming, which is facilitating deep draft ships, biggest ships in the region. But at the same time, as I said, the competition, India is putting up two deep draft ports in their own development. Bangladesh is developing deep ports. East coast, west coast, if you look at our east coast and west coast, we have Trincomalee to be developed. Similarly, India is planning to develop a bulk port in the Bay of Bengal region. There's capacity expansion in the Middle East. The pie is expanding also, the business is expanding in the regions. Remember, the region is also strongly competing with infrastructure development, and there's a lot of interest in trade and investment towards India because of its a massive market and forecasted to be the fifth or third largest economy by the next 20-30 years. So the buying power of Indians are growing. The economic growth is 6% plus, which will have a spillover effect for Sri Lanka definitely, provided we do the right things at the right time and the right reforms. So yeah, South Asia is poised for growth, which is the good news.
Do you think the location is a good enough tool for competition?
Certainly not. That was 20-30 years ago. I'll give you an example. United Arab Emirates, Dubai, is not in the international sea route. You have to go north to get into Dubai. But the visionary leaderships of those countries saw the reforms and the necessary infrastructure, both soft and hard, created in those places, and they managed to attract the biggest investors into those countries. So the location doesn't play because it was a old fishing village in history, whereas Abu Dhabi was the main oil rich estate in UAE. Singapore also did all the hard work to develop it to attract investors and capital and know-how. Unfortunately, we did have the original vision in the early 1970s when we make the first transshipment hub in the Indian subcontinent, and we were leading the growth potential, but beyond that we lost out and we didn't continue the reform progress and we gave into protectionism, and as a result we have left with the location rather than an investment destination. So I don't believe in only the location. Yes, location has certain advantages, but that is fast diminishing because today technology and markets are changing, the way businesses are done are changing, the global capital shifts are changing. So all those factors in, if we don't create that conducive environment, location is not going to play the key role anymore, and we can lose out in the long run if we don't do those reforms extremely fast. I would say it has to be done yesterday, but that's the message that I have for policymakers and anybody who is listening. And the potential is so huge, unfortunately. For example, the UAE Dubai Free Zone, which is called the Jebel Ali Free Zone, has an annual turnover of United States $104 billion, whereas our whole economy is now shrink to $78 billion. So you can see the potential. Logistics and shipping can be a key pillar to build this economy. Rule of law and the business climate has to be in line with international standards. Either we have to be better than Singapore, or either we have to be equal than Singapore. Either we have to be better than United Arab Emirates, or at least equal those countries if we want to attract future investors. That's how I see the whole picture.
And that brings us to the end of Deep Dive with Mr. Rohan Masakorala, the founder of Shippers Academy International. Thank you, sir, for your time. For the Business Buzz team, I'm Hashni Pathirana.
The Business Buzz.
Now here's a look at the latest global commodity prices. It appears that while Sri Lankans are having to face higher energy prices, the case is not really the same in the global situation. Global crude oil prices were trading at $70.30 per barrel, down 10.1% monthly and 4.3% year-on-year, according to Trading Economics. Brent was trading at $75.25 per barrel, down 8.55% monthly and 4.05% year-on-year. Meanwhile, natural gas was trading at $2.38 per metric million British thermal units, or MMBTU, down 29.69% monthly and 62.74% year-on-year. Coal was trading at $150 per ton, up 22.76% monthly but down 62.48% year-on-year. They say better late than never. And Sri Lanka is finally getting a global marketing campaign after 16 long years. The Sri Lanka Tourism Promotion Bureau last week launched its new global tagline, "You'll come back for more." Sri Lanka is to roll out its first global tourism marketing campaign since 2007, promising tourists that, quote, "You'll come back for more," unquote. Although campaigns had been mooted and then developed over the years, they were always stillborn, usually due to political reasons. The new campaign is set to unfold in phases, initially focusing up to February on communicating the restoration of stability in the country and its readiness to welcome tourists. Subsequent stages to elaborate on the central theme of "You'll come back for more," targeting key source markets of Sri Lanka tourism. Ogilvy, the creative agency behind the campaign, based its strategy on insights revealing that over 30% of tourists visiting Sri Lanka are repeat travelers. Tonight on Food for Thought, we highlight the need of our policymakers to stop causing shocks to our already battered economy, which is struggling to get back on track. Over the last 18 months, Sri Lankans have become used to the catchphrase economic stability. But what exactly is this much talked about economic stability? To put it briefly, economic stability requires a government to protect the economy from shocks. The country needs to be run smoothly, not be put through a roller coaster ride. For starters, economic stability means energy security. That means an uninterrupted power supply at a price that isn't increased 4 times a year as the CEB has done in the recent past. It also requires a proper fuel supply. So let's make sure we don't ever go back to those nightmarish days when people were dropping dead from exhaustion after standing in fuel queues for days. It also means rational taxation. So the government needs to stop fiddling around with the VAT, income tax and other taxes. Rushing to increase taxes whenever the government needs more spending cash doesn't make for sound macroeconomics. The economy should not be the government's piggy bank. It means having a reasonably stable currency. That means the rupee should not be allowed to plunge as it did last year, but neither should we have unrealistic pegs that make matters worse, which is what we experienced last year. Then there's interest rates. Again, interest rates need to be rational and realistic. We can't have rates at 8% and then shoot up to 32% within a couple of months. That goes for all types of rates, lending rates, fixed deposits, savings, T-bills, T-bonds, etc. Next we come to inflation. Hyperinflation will kill your economy very quickly. The government has brought it under control now. But it was not so long ago that we had official inflation rates hovering around 100%. And of course, the vital prerequisite for economic stability is political stability. That means having a parliament and a government that has the mandate of the people. And that means elections. The sooner, the better. This is what the president last week promised will take place next year. Presidential, parliamentary and provincial. He did seem to forget the local government elections, which is strange because nominations were called many months ago and hundreds of millions of rupees have already been spent on preparatory work. Remember, investors hate surprises. So the sooner we stop shocking the economy, the faster our country will get back on the road to normalcy. We'll leave you tonight with words of wisdom from a global leader, as we always do. The noted American political satirist and journalist P.J. O'Rourke once said, "When buying and selling is controlled by legislation, the first ones to be bought are the legislators." Sad but true. And that's all the time we have for you tonight. For the Newsfirst and Business Buzz team, I'm Theruni Karunaratne. We'll see you again next week, same time. Until then, take care and good night.
The Business Buzz.